thought he had control. He believed his badge made him untouchable. But today, Officer Cross made the biggest mistake of his life. He picked the wrong man to challenge. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay until the end to see how justice was served in the most unexpected way. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun stretched golden rays through the dense canopy of Griffith Park, a warm breeze carrying the distant hum of city life. The scent of freshly cut grass and sun-warmed asphalt lingered in the air. Families lounged on picnic blankets, children raced along winding paths, joggers kept steady rhythms, their footsteps tapping against the pavement. Elderly couples strolled hand in hand, savoring the quiet comfort of the afternoon. Amidst the life and movement of the park, one man sat alone on an old wooden bench, unnoticed by most. He was stillness in a world of motion. His posture was relaxed, one booted foot resting over the other, calloused fingers casually spilling birdseed onto the pavement. A small flock of pigeons gathered, pecking eagerly. His face, partly shadowed by a simple leather hat, revealed nothing, calm, unreadable, unmoved. His clothes were unremarkable, faded blue jeans, a plain brown shirt, a worn leather belt with a tarnished silver buckle. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet his stillness carried a quiet, formidable weight. Bruce Lee sat undisturbed in the heart of the park. For years, his life had been defined by movement, discipline, precision, and endless pursuit of mastery. But in this moment, none of it mattered. No opponents. No cameras. No expectations. Just the soft cooing of pigeons and the distant laughter of strangers. Peace, not the kind that comes from the absence of conflict, but the mastery of oneself. Then came the boots. Heavy. Purposeful. Each step deliberate. Each sound a command. Officer Dan Cross moved through the park like a man who knew his authority. His crisp LAPD uniform was immaculate, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the world in distorted fragments. His duty belt was lined with tools of enforcement, a baton, a taser, handcuffs, a radio, and his firearm, each polished, each an extension of his power. His gaze swept over the park, families, joggers, teenagers near the playground. Then he saw him. The man on the bench. Too still. Too composed. Not a jogger catching his breath. Not a father watching over children. Just sitting. Feeding birds. Cross's lip curled in distaste. He had seen men like this before, old relics who thought they were above the rules. Men who took up space without purpose. People who had forgotten that order required obedience. He had no patience for them. His steps veered off the main path, his boots striking harder against the pavement. His approach was deliberate, designed to make his presence known before he even spoke. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace, glancing between the officer and the man on the bench. A group of young men at a picnic table exchanged knowing looks. They had seen Cross in action before. They knew what happened when someone didn't comply fast enough. Cross came to a halt in front of the bench, his shadow stretching over Bruce. He planted his feet wide, hands resting on his belt. His posture demanded recognition. But Bruce did not move. The pigeons kept pecking, undisturbed. A flicker of irritation crossed Cross's face. This was the part where people looked up, acknowledged him, responded accordingly. But the old man remained exactly as he was. As if he hadn't even noticed the officer standing there. That wasn't going to fly. Cross shifted his weight, clearing his throat. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "You need to move along." Bruce Lee did not react. He didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge the words. He simply dropped another handful of birdseed. The pigeons fluttered, oblivious to the tension thickening in the air. For the first time, something unfamiliar flickered through Cross's mind. Not quite confusion. Not quite hesitation. But something close. Tightened with something unfamiliar, something he refused to name. His authority had always been enough. His voice, his uniform, his presence, they commanded respect. They demanded obedience. But this man, this old man, treated him as if he were nothing. As if he did not exist. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the park faded into the background, the casual conversations, the laughter, the distant bark of a dog, it all became distant, irrelevant. A tension had settled in the air, thick and palpable. The kind that signaled something was about to happen. Cross's grip on the baton tightened, his knuckles whitening. His patience had frayed past the point of restraint. This wasn't about enforcing a park rule anymore. It wasn't about some meaningless ordinance or maintaining order. This was personal. You think you can just sit here like this? His voice was lower now, rougher, edged with something dangerous. Bruce Lee did not look up. His fingers moved once more, releasing another small cascade of birdseed to the ground. The pigeons remained unbothered, pecking at the pavement, oblivious to the growing storm. Cross felt something snap inside him. His body moved before his mind caught up, his baton lifted in a sharp, deliberate motion, poised to make contact. The crackle of adrenaline surged through his veins. But before the baton could complete its arc, something changed. A shift. A movement so small, so impossibly fast, that Cross barely registered it before it was too late. One moment, Bruce Lee was still. The next, the world had flipped. Cross's wrist was caught, lightly, effortlessly, as if the air itself had simply decided to stop him. The grip wasn't aggressive. It wasn't forceful. It just was. His arm, locked in place, refused to obey him. For the first time in years, Officer Cross felt something cold and unfamiliar creep up his spine. Fear. Bruce Lee lifted his gaze then, just slightly. Not enough to be threatening, not enough to be confrontational. Just enough. His eyes, though calm, unreadable, met Cross's behind the dark tint of mirrored sunglasses. And then, in a single smooth motion, Bruce released him. Cross stumbled back a half step, his breath caught in his throat. His grip on the baton loosened instinctively before he caught himself, fingers tightening around it again as if clinging to what little authority he had left in this moment. Around them, the park had gone silent. The young men by the picnic table sat motionless, their faces caught between shock and awe. The woman with the stroller had stopped completely, one hand hovering over the handle as if unsure whether to move. Nobody spoke. Bruce Lee did not rise. Did not move. He simply returned to feeding the birds. And for the first time in his career, Officer Dan Cross had no idea what to do next. The world seemed to slow. Cross's breath was shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. His hand was on his holster, his fingers brushing the grip of his firearm, muscle memory, instinct, years of training all telling him the same thing: regain control. But before he could draw, before even a fraction of a second passed, Bruce moved. Not a lunge. Not an attack. Just a shift, small, precise, effortless. And yet, in that instant, Cross knew. He knew with a certainty that struck deeper than reason, deeper than training. He would not win this. The weight of his gun felt suddenly different. Heavier. Not a tool of power, but a choice. A line he was standing on the edge of, teetering, one breath away from stepping too far. Bruce's eyes met his. Calm. Unshaken. There was no fear in them, no aggression. Just an understanding that chilled Cross to his core. The people around them were silent now. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Cross's grip on the gun wavered. And then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he let go. His hand moved away from the holster. The tension in his shoulders remained, the frustration still boiling in his gut, but he did not draw. He couldn't. Bruce said nothing. Did nothing. Just watched. The pigeons pecked at the ground between them, indifferent to the storm that had almost erupted. The world continued as if nothing had happened. Cross took a step back. Then another. His boots felt heavier than before, each movement dragging with the weight of something he couldn't fully name. He wasn't just walking away from the bench. He was walking away from something else, something bigger, something deeper. A few onlookers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. No one cheered. No one spoke. But they had seen. They would remember. Cross turned sharply, his jaw tight, his breath unsteady. He strode away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his badge gleaming under the fading afternoon sun. Behind him, Bruce Lee remained seated, as he had been from the beginning. Unmoved. Untouched. And as the officer disappeared down the path, he scattered another handful of birdseed, watching as the pigeons gathered once more. Unspoken prayer, his radio crackled. Unit 17, status check. Officer Cross, do you copy? The voice from dispatch was routine, detached, unaware of the chaos unraveling within him. But to Cross, it was a lifeline, a tether back to the structure, to the authority, to the control he had just lost. His fingers twitched toward his radio, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before he pressed the button. Unit 17, Code 4, he said, his voice strained but steady enough. The radio hissed in response. Copy that, 17. Stand by. Cross exhaled sharply through his nose, willing his hands to stop shaking. He had to leave. Staying here meant stewing in the humiliation, meant standing in the middle of this crowd, powerless. And powerlessness was something he could not afford. His gaze flickered to the gun still lying beside the baton on the ground. It sat there untouched, unthreatening, as if it had never held any real significance to begin with. Bruce hadn't moved. He remained seated, as he had been from the beginning, his posture unchanged. The weight of his presence was suffocating in its simplicity. No mockery. No words. Just an unshakable, immovable force. Cross bent down, his movements stiff, mechanical. He picked up the baton first, then his firearm, holstering them both with an exaggerated precision, as if performing the action would somehow restore the control he had lost. His shoulders squared, his jaw locked. But nothing about this moment belonged to him anymore. The murmurs in the crowd persisted, the occasional flicker of a camera phone catching the late afternoon sun. The entire park had witnessed what happened here. And more than that, they would remember. Cross swallowed the lump in his throat, his pride screaming for retaliation, for some final assertion of dominance. But there was nothing left to assert. Not here. Not now. So he did the only thing he could. He turned. Without another word, without another glance, he walked away. His boots hit the pavement harder than before, each step a thunderous drumbeat of frustration and disgrace. His mind raced, cycling through 1,000 justifications, 1,000 ways to frame the story in his favor. But no matter how he twisted it, no matter how much authority he thought he had, he knew the truth. And so did everyone else. Behind him, Bruce Lee remained on the bench, scattering another handful of birdseed to the pavement. The pigeons pecked eagerly, untouched by the storm that had just passed. It was over. But Cross knew, deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. Just like a freight train. His breath hitched. His fingers twitched at his sides. For a long, terrible second, he just stood there. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The badge had always been his shield. His proof. His authority. It was the thing that set him apart from the others, the thing that made his word law. Without it, what was he? The silence stretched unbearably long, the air thick with judgment. The crowd had gone completely still now, their attention no longer on Bruce Lee, but on the officer unraveling before their eyes. The phones were still recording, their tiny unblinking lenses capturing his downfall in real time. His throat felt like sandpaper. He tried to swallow, but the lump in his chest only grew heavier. Dan, the older officer's voice came again, softer this time, but no less firm. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Cross clenched his jaw so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. Give me your badge. The words echoed in his skull like a gavel slamming down. He could argue. He could fight. He could insist that he had been the one wronged, that this wasn't what it looked like, that Bruce Lee had what? Sat on a bench? Fed some birds? Disarmed him without violence? There was no case to make. No defense. No authority left to cling to. His hand felt foreign as he reached up, his fingers brushing against the cool metal pin to his chest. Not like this. Not in front of them. But there was no other way. With movements that felt disconnected from his own body, he unfastened the badge. The metal gleamed in the fading sunlight, a final cruel trick of the universe. He hesitated, his fingers wrapped around it, as if by sheer will he could make it mean something again. Then, slowly, he extended it forward. The older officer took it without a word. The weight across his chest collapsed in on itself. Somewhere in the crowd, a shutter clicked. The finality of it struck him harder than anything else. The moment had been immortalized. He was no longer Officer Cross. Just a man. The older officer studied him for a long moment, then turned to the younger officer beside him. "Get him out of here." Cross didn't resist. He couldn't. His legs carried him forward on autopilot, his boots dragging against the pavement, but he wasn't truly walking, he was retreating. Fleeing. As he passed the bench, he caught a glimpse of Bruce Lee. Still seated. Still calm. Still feeding the birds. And Cross knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the man had seen all of this coming before it had even begun. As he disappeared into the distance, the pigeons fluttered around Bruce, pecking at the scattered seed. Unbothered. Untouched. Just like him. "Back to the precinct," he instructed, his voice steady but laced with something deeper, something weary. The younger officer hesitated for only a moment before nodding and stepping away, disappearing into the thinning crowd. The older officer remained. His grip loosened slightly, as if releasing some unseen tension that had gripped him from the moment he arrived. He looked at Bruce again, not as a suspect, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Bruce did not move. He simply sat there, as he had since the beginning, his posture relaxed, his presence unwavering. The wind rustled the leaves above them, sending shifting patterns of light across the ground. The pigeons continued to peck at the scattered seed, untouched by the weight of human affairs. The officer exhaled, shaking his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in understanding. "You handled that well," he finally admitted. Bruce's expression did not change. "I handled it the only way it could be handled." The older officer gave a small, tired nod. He had seen enough to know that was true. A beat of silence passed between them, a quiet exchange of recognition, of understanding that went beyond words. Then, with nothing more to say, the officer adjusted his belt, gave one last glance at the fallen seed and the man who had remained unmoved through it all, and turned away. The park slowly returned to itself. People who had gathered began to disperse, their conversations hushed, their gazes lingering on the spot where Cross had stood before disappearing from sight. A few stayed behind, their eyes flicking toward Bruce as if hoping for some final gesture, some sign that acknowledged the significance of what had just taken place. But there was none. Bruce remained as he had always been, still, composed, indifferent to the chaos that had momentarily touched this place. He reached into his palm, let another handful of birdseed spill to the ground, and watched as the pigeons gathered once more. The moment was over. The world moved on. And Bruce Lee never had to stand up. As the pigeons eagerly pecked at the ground, his movements were slow, deliberate, as if considering the weight of the question before finally responding. In a way. The older officer tilted his head slightly, waiting for more, but Bruce offered nothing else. No elaboration, no explanation. Just that simple, measured response. The officer exhaled, his hands resting on his belt as he studied the man before him. There was something about Bruce, not just in how he moved, but in how he didn't move. A stillness that wasn't just physical but deeper, rooted. You knew exactly how that was going to play out, didn't you? The officer asked. Bruce finally looked at him again, his gaze steady. I knew who he was before he did. The officer let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, I believe that. A breeze passed through the park, rustling the leaves above them. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, the sound carrying over the hum of the city beyond. Life had moved on. The officer reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad and a pen. He hesitated for a moment before scribbling something down, tearing the paper and folding it once before placing it on the bench beside Bruce. If you ever need anything, he said simply. Bruce glanced at the paper but didn't pick it up. He didn't need to. The gesture had already been understood. The officer gave him one last nod before stepping back, turning on his heel, and walking away. Bruce remained still, watching as the last remnants of the moment faded into normalcy. The pigeons, the trees, the sun dipping lower in the sky, it was as if nothing had ever happened. But it had. And as the officer disappeared from view, Bruce released another handful of birdseed and let the world keep turning. The sun sank lower, spilling its golden light across the park, stretching long, dappled shadows along the pavement. The sky above had begun its slow transformation, shifting from a soft blue to the warm hues of dusk. A gentle breeze rustled through the treetops, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant aroma of food vendors preparing for the evening rush. The sounds of life, the rhythmic slap of sneakers against concrete, the hum of conversation, the occasional ring of a bicycle bell, resumed as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. And yet, for those who had been there, something had changed. It was in the way people glanced toward the old wooden bench where Bruce Lee had sat, their eyes lingering just a little longer than before. It was in the hushed voices, and the way strangers exchanged knowing looks, as if confirming to one another that they had truly seen what they had seen. Some shook their heads in quiet disbelief, others spoke in murmurs, their words laced with something that hovered between admiration and uncertainty. Near the playground, a boy tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. Who was that man? The father, a man who had likely seen his share of conflicts in life, did not answer right away. He simply watched as Bruce remained on the bench, as unmoved as the moment he had first arrived. Finally, after a pause, he spoke, his tone low, deliberate. Someone you don't mess with. The boy nodded, though he likely didn't understand the full weight of the words. He only knew what he had seen, an officer stripped of his authority without a single punch thrown, a confrontation won without violence. Bruce remained still, as though untouched by the weight of the moment. The last remnants of birdseed slipped through his fingers, scattering onto the pavement. The pigeons, untroubled by the affairs of men, pecked eagerly at the offering, oblivious to the spectacle that had unfolded around them. Across the park, a pair of young men sat at a picnic table, their heads bent over a phone, reviewing their recording of the incident. One of them let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he muttered, "Man, this is gonna go viral." A woman near the fountain tapped furiously on her phone, no doubt drafting a post before she had even left the park. The internet would know before the sun had fully set. For most, life was returning to normal. For Cross, nothing ever would. Beyond the tree line, beyond the laughter of children and the hum of the city, he walked alone. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body rigid with tension. The uniform that once made him feel invincible now felt like nothing more than fabric, just a layer of cloth draped over a man stripped of power, stripped of identity. His mind was a battlefield of regret and denial, replaying the moment over and over, searching for a way to rewrite what had been burned into the memory of too many witnesses. Could he have said something different? Could he have acted sooner? Could he have regained control before it all slipped away? But there was no answer. No way to erase what had been seen. No way to undo what had been recorded. The world had already moved on without him. Back in the park, Bruce exhaled softly, reaching up to adjust the brim of his hat. The evening light painted the world in amber, casting long shadows against the pavement as the city pulsed beyond the park's edges. The distant sound of traffic, the faint melody of a street musician setting up for the night, it all folded seamlessly into the rhythm of life, continuing as it always had. Bruce's gaze drifted to the slip of paper left on the bench. It had been placed there with care, an offering of understanding, perhaps even respect. He picked it up, his calloused fingers brushing over its surface, then let it fall back onto the wooden slats beside him. It did not matter. Some things did not need to be acknowledged to be understood. And with that, he stood. There was no urgency in his movement, no grand gesture, no final look back. Just a quiet, deliberate shift, as if rising from the bench was no more significant than a change in the wind. To him, the moment had already passed. To everyone else, it would never be forgotten. As he walked, the remnants of the crowd lingered, their eyes following him even as they pretended to return to their lives. Some whispered, some simply watched. Near a picnic table, a young man still clutching his phone hesitated before speaking. "Sir." Bruce paused, tilting his head slightly, waiting. The young man swallowed, still grappling with what he had witnessed. That was incredible. His voice was laced with something between awe and disbelief. "I mean, I don't even know how you," he trailed off, shaking his head. "You didn't even fight him, and you still won." Bruce studied him for a long moment before offering a simple truth. "Fighting is the last resort." The words landed heavily, not just in the young man's ears, but in his mind. A lesson given without force, a truth that needed no embellishment. The young man nodded slowly, absorbing it. Bruce gave a small nod in return and walked on. Behind him, the slip of paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, untouched, unnecessary. The pigeons returned to the bench, reclaiming the last scattered seeds, unbothered by the weight of human affairs. The world kept moving. The city pulsed beyond the park, its rhythm unbroken. The last streaks of daylight stretched across the pavement, casting long, fading shadows. And just like that, it was over. Justice had been served. But the lesson remained. Power isn't about force, it's about control. What do you think about what happened today? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. And tell us, where are you watching from?